Imagine yourself strolling down a wide Parisian avenue. It's late April in the year 1874. The sidewalks and cafes are filled with the fresh scents of spring, laughter after a long winter, and a few artists adding color to the chaos. Artists painting on the street? You question yourself. That's something new. Everywhere you go, there's a buzz about an art exhibit with sketchy paintings that resembled unfinished wallpaper. You hear the names Monet, Renoir, and Degas, and you wonder, could there be any connection with these men painting on the street? Wouldn't it be great if we could time travel to witness the birth of an art movement that would change the course of art history? I'm not a scientist with time traveling capabilities, but I am an art lover that would like to transport you through the history of Impressionism. Impressionism was a 19th century art movement that produced several masterpieces, dozens of famous artists, and influenced the birth of subsequent art styles. Today, I'm going to give you a brief history of Impressionism, introduce you to several artists of the movement as we view a few of their works, and finally, I'll show you how Impressionism gave birth to later art movements and talk about the key players in these new art styles. Impressionistic painting began in Paris around 1860. The artists at the time were experiencing a new sense of modernity in science and rebelled against classical subject matter. They were attempting to create the impression of a specific moment in life. Light, the changes in weather, and the passage of time were often their focus. The artists migrated away from symmetry and realism, and they used color for definition instead of using traditional black lines. History.com tells us that in April of 1874, 30 artists held an exhibit hosted by and in the studio of photographer Felix Nader. The exhibit was an alternative to the official state-sanctioned exhibit, which had set art standards since 1667. An insult from the press over Claude Monet's painting Impression Sunrise lent the group their name Impressionists. The critics said that the work in the show was unfinished and compared it unfavorably to wallpaper, saying that the group painted nothing but impressions. With Impressionism's move away from classical techniques, in realism, the focus shifted to broader subject matter that couldn't be found within a studio. Thanks to John Rand, an American painter living in London, Impressionist painters could finally move their painting outdoors, or to use the French term, en plein air. History.com tells us that in 1841, Rand invented paint in a tube. The new technology forever changed the art world and allowed artists the freedom to move outside studio walls by giving them paints that were pre-mixed and portable. After making our way to the spark of Impressionism in the heart of 19th century Paris, I'd now like to tell you about several of the most famous artists of the movement. 30 artists were showcased at the first Impressionism exhibit in 1874. And there are at least 97 artists that fall under the category of Impressionism. But today, I'd like to talk about just 4 of these artists. One of the most famous painters of Impressionism is Claude Monet. Criticism of his painting entitled Impression at Sunrise is how the movement was given the label Impressionism. Monet was a master of natural light and often painted the same scene at different times of day and different seasons to capture its changing nature. Monet was not trying to reproduce exactly what he saw, but a mere impression of what his eyes were capturing in the moment. Justin Wolfe at theartstory.org describes Monet's artistic process very succinctly. He tended to paint simple impressions or subtle hints of his subjects, using very soft brushstrokes and unmixed colors to create a natural vibrating effect, as if nature itself were alive on the canvas. He did not wait for the paint to dry before applying successive layers. This wet-on-wet technique produced softer edges and blurred the boundaries that merely suggested a three-dimensional plane rather than depicting it realistically. Monet wasn't alone in this Impressionist movement. Pierre-Auguste Renoir is considered the other leader of the movement. Renoir started out as a porcelain painter before copying paintings at the Louvre Museum in Paris, where he later met and painted alongside Monet. The two shared similar interests, but where Monet focused on natural light, Renoir focused on artificial light. Everyday life, normal people, dance halls, and especially the female form dominate Renoir's works, rather than just scenery. He also used very vibrant colors, but light and loose brushstrokes to give emotion to his human subjects. Renoir's focus on modern life was very similar to fellow artist Edward Degas. Degas loved to paint indoor scenes of modern life. Dancers, laundresses, and hat makers. He was a skilled draftsman and didn't feel the need to make his art spontaneous. The National Gallery of Art explains how Degas differentiates from his Impressionist counterparts. His focus on urban subjects, artificial light, and careful drawing distinguish him from other Impressionists. A steely observer of everyday scenes, Degas tirelessly analyzed positions, gestures, and movements. The last Impressionist painter I'd like to introduce you to is neither male nor French, although she did live in Paris and studied under Edward Degas. American painter Mary Cassatt. She mostly focused on and painted women and girls in daily life, either at home or in public spaces. She used bold colors, considered gaudy by some, that defied and differentiated her style. TheArtStory.org tells us that her work features a number of innovations, including the reduction of three-dimensional space and the application of bright, even garish colors in her paintings, both of which heralded later developments in modern art. We can see what started as a rebellion against classical form was an ever-evolving movement itself. Impressionism led the way for modern art styles such as Post-Impressionism and Pointillism, to name only two, although all of what we consider modern art today, we can trace the roots back to the experiments in art that these Impressionist artists made. In the late 1890s, Post-Impressionism became a defined movement. It differs from Impressionism in a few subtle but key ways. Oxford Art Online details the difference between Post-Impressionism and Impressionism by saying, the Post-Impressionists rejected Impressionism's concern with the spontaneous and naturalistic rendering of light and color. Instead, they favored an emphasis on more symbolic content, formal order, and structure. Similar to the Impressionists, however, they stressed the artificiality of the picture. The Post-Impressionists also believed that color could be independent from form, and composition was an emotional and aesthetic bearer of meaning. Post-Impressionist artists used artificial colors, broad brushstrokes, and often heavy layers of paint to evoke emotion rather than realism. Where Impressionism was about capturing the impression of a fleeting moment, Post-Impressionism was about capturing the emotion. One of the few artists to bridge this change in style was Paul Cézanne. Cézanne was among the first artists who were featured at the very first Impressionism exhibit, but he had a desire to have more solidity and structure in his work, something he felt Impressionists lacked. Late in his career, he went even further and broke down objects into their geometric bases, which would greatly influence Pablo Picasso and the creation of Cubanism. One of the most famous post-impressionism artist by far is Vincent van Gogh. The National Gallery of Art tells Van Gogh's story. Van Gogh's earliest paintings were earth-tone scenes of nature and peasants, but he became increasingly influenced by Japanese prints and the work of the Impressionists in France. In 1886, he arrived in Paris, where his real formation as a painter began. Working feverishly, Van Gogh pushed his art style to an even greater expression with intense, energetic brushwork in saturated complementary colors. Yet his densely painted canvases remain connected to nature. Their color and rhythmic surfaces communicate the spiritual power that he believed inhabited and shaped nature's forms. Color and emotion are the hallmarks of post-impressionism, as clearly seen in Van Gogh's paintings, even if his subjects weren't seen clearly. Clearly defined subjects, or the lack thereof, brings us to another movement that branched off of Impressionism, pointillism. Georges Seurat used a technique of applying contrasting dots of color to a canvas that, from a distance, blended together to form a single color and reveal his subject. He achieved a sense of shimmering light with the use of broken color and without the use of any straight lines. He paid more attention to composition and the signs of color than any Impressionist painter ever did. Even though there are only about 35 artist categories as post-impressionistic and approximately 7 classified pointillists, compared to the almost 100 Impressionist painters, these two movements are nonetheless as prolific and impressive. Today I introduced you to just a few of the amazing artists that created a new art movement. A movement that rebelled against traditional artistic techniques and embraced modernity and new technologies. Little did these artists know that they would set the art world on a new course. So in review, Impressionism was a 19th century art movement that produced several masterpieces, dozens of famous artists, and influenced the birth of subsequent art styles. We know that we can't time travel, but what we can do is really travel. Instead of imagining yourself in Paris in 74, maybe you can find yourself in Paris in 2019. If you do happen to make it to Paris now or in the future, you can still stroll down those same wide Parisian avenues, sit in bustling sidewalk cafes, and watch painters almost everywhere around the city. If you, like me, would love to walk among the greatest Impressionist artists created, then, if you can make it, you may want to go to the Museum d'Orsay on the left bank of the Seine, like I did this past May. The museum is often overlooked by visitors who flock to its sister museum, the Louvre, but the d'Orsay houses some of the best Impressionist art anywhere: Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Cassatt.